I'm Gabriel, and this is The Rare Mind. Today we're going to expose the three biggest lies that INFJs and INTJs carry, the ones that make you feel cold, impractical, or impossible to understand. By the end, I'll show you how to turn those labels into silent strength instead of cages. They are told they are too complicated, as if the very depth of their being were a crime. That label presses down like a silent exile, pushing them toward the margins of belonging. What begins as a careless word becomes an invisible wall, and in that wall they walk alone, misunderstood for the very richness that was meant to be their gift. These labels harden into cages, subtle yet unyielding. Each judgment becomes a bar, each misunderstanding a lock, until authenticity itself is restrained. The voice inside longs to be unfiltered, but fear whispers of rejection, and so brilliance is diluted for the sake of comfort. I learned to ask not why me, but what is this pain asking of me? And in that question I found the faint sound of freedom. The cruelty of myth is not only in what others say, but in what it makes us believe about ourselves. Many begin to wonder if something is broken at the core, if their very essence is a flaw. This inner fracture bleeds quietly, making it harder to trust one's own vision, harder to walk without apology. From there, self-doubt is fed like a shadow at the table. Instead of clarity, fog thickens. What could be a gift of perception becomes a labyrinth of second-guessing, where even the truest impulses are silenced. I have carried visions no room could hold and paid the price of seeing too far. Yet the turning begins when the myth itself is named. To drag it into the open is to rob it of its venom. Once seen, it can no longer hide as truth. What was once a weight becomes a doorway. What was once a chain becomes a signal. In that exposure lies the first fracture of the prison. And through that fracture, light enters declaring, the lies are fragile, but you are not. Chapter 2, Lie Number 1. You're cold and uncaring. They call the INTJ a detached strategist, the INFJ an unreachable mystic. From the outside, their silence is mistaken for absence, their distance for indifference. But in truth, silence holds weight, and distance is often a form of devotion. What looks like frost is often fire concealed, a care so deep it chooses precision over display. Beneath the surface, both types ache with intensity. Their depth is not worn on sleeves, but hidden in the architecture of thought, in the choices no one sees. The INFJ carries empathy into vision, sketching maps of meaning from pain. The INTJ bends care into solutions, fighting chaos with structure. I felt the fracture of being known in fragments. I would rather be whole and alone. This misreading births unnecessary guilt in the INFJ, who wonders why compassion is doubted. For the INTJ, it sparks defensiveness, the burden of proving that feeling and discipline are not opposites. The irony is cruel. The very depth of their love makes them careful in how it is given, and that carefulness is twisted into accusation. But when the lie is pierced, when both types reclaim the truth of their care, their relationships shift. They no longer defend against the charge of coldness, but stand in the gravity of their devotion. Love is not loud to them. It is enduring. It is steady. It is vision that does not falter when storms arrive. The revelation comes quietly yet unshakably. What was mistaken for ice was always the deep, unextinguished ember of fire. Chapter 3. Lie number 2. You're too idealistic to be practical. They are accused of dreaming too far ahead, as if vision were a weakness, as if hope itself were impractical. The charge falls heavy on INFJs and INTJs alike, disconnected from reality, lost in abstraction. But their gaze forward is not escape, it is architecture, the shaping of futures long before others can see the foundations. I want to hear your voice in this. Which of these three lies has been the hardest for you to carry? Drop it in the comments, even in a single sentence. Writing it down is already the first act of breaking the chain, and I'll be reading your reflections closely. For the INFJ, Ideals crystallize into moral clarity, a compass forged in silence. Their visions do not drift in clouds. They carve pathways through shadows, turning compassion into direction. For the INTJ, imagination is blueprint. Strategy becomes the language of hope, and structure grows where others saw only mist. I chose meaning when nothing else remained, and the darkness obeyed that choice. Society misreads this forward focus as naivete. It mocks the dreamer while living unknowingly in the structures those same dreamers once envisioned. To think ahead is not to flee the present, but to refine it, to bring it into alignment with what could be. Their minds do not wander aimlessly. They march with intent. And in embracing this misunderstood gift, their so-called impracticality becomes their mastery. What others discard as impossible, they quietly build. What others fear as ungrounded, they weave into lasting form. The truth surfaces with undeniable force. Vision was never the enemy of reality, it was always its deepest architect. Chapter 4. Lie number 3. You're impossible to understand. The world says they are enigmas, impossible to reach, forever locked away in labyrinths of thought. This sentence of misunderstanding becomes a prophecy of isolation, feeding the ache of being perpetually unseen. To be misread again and again is to question whether connection is ever truly possible. Yet the wound is not in complexity itself, but in its reduction. INFJs and INTJs are pressed into shallow molds, their nuance flattened into stereotypes. The subtlety of vision, the layered way of seeing, is mistaken for distance. I have watched silence turn into a forge, and I walked out different. Complexity is not a flaw, it is the very architecture of insight. The rare mind weaves connections invisible to most, not to alienate, but to illuminate. Their intricacy is not confusion. It is clarity too rich for shortcuts, too alive for simplifications. To call it unreachable is to reveal one's own impatience with depth. This myth, when believed, tempts them to withhold, to guard their perspective as if it were a burden too heavy for others. But reframed, being misunderstood is no longer exile, it is distinction. What seemed like alienation becomes the seal of rare vision, and what once made them shrink becomes the very crown of their difference. In that revelation, isolation dissolves into calling. They were never impossible to understand, they were simply meant to be raw. Chapter 5. The psychological trap of believing these lies. A lie repeated becomes a mirror. Hear it long enough, and the reflection shifts until you no longer know which face is yours. Identity is carved not by truth but by echo and the myths around INFJ and INTJ turn into stories they unknowingly recite. The cage is no longer external, it is carried within. Anxiety seeps in where certainty once lived. To express oneself feels risky, as if every word might confirm the accusation of being too much or too strange. Hesitation becomes habit, shrinking the voice until it folds into silence. I mistook exile for punishment, until I found the work waiting for me there. The INFJ begins to doubt the very intuition that guides them, questioning whether the visions they see are illusion. The INTJ begins to second-guess their execution, wondering if their strategies will hold when pressed against the weight of scrutiny. Both are wounded not by their nature, but by believing the distortions projected onto it. If, when I mentioned that label of being too complicated, you felt that sting of isolation, hit the like button. It tells me this conversation matters to you, and it helps me bring more tools for dismantling those myths that keep NI dominants doubting themselves. Yet awareness turns the trap inside out. To see the lie for what it is robs it of its authority. In contrast, the truth begins to emerge. The cage was never truth, but training. What was meant to diminish becomes the raw material for resilience. And from that clarity rises a silent rebellion. The rare mind no longer bends to myths, but bends the myths into fire, a fire that shapes destiny rather than smothers it. Chapter 6. Nietzsche's Lens On. FALSE, narrative, Nietzsche spoke of slave morality fabricated truths, whispered by the fearful to chain the strong. Lies are not harmless. They are architecture, designed to keep the rare mind subdued. When INFJs and INTJs walk under these projections, they carry a weight that was never theirs, the burden of society's unease with difference. The world projects its fear onto them because their clarity unsettles. Vision is disruptive to those who live only in the immediate. To carry foresight is to carry suspicion, as if seeing beyond the surface were an act of rebellion. I have seen despair blink first when I refused to bow to it. These lies, when accepted, are chains disguised as character judgments. But Nietzsche's call resounds. Reject the narratives inherited, affirm the path no one else can walk for you. The rare mind is not meant to live under borrowed scripts, it is meant to write new ones. Here, I don't just list stereotypes. We go deep into the mechanism, like how idealism is actually strategic foresight when owned by an INFJ or INTJ. If you want to keep expanding that lens and reclaiming your own narrative, subscribe. Every week, I bring a step forward toward clarity and strength. For nay dominance, this becomes more than philosophy, it is lifeblood. To affirm their unique path is to rise from the dust of deception into the sovereignty of clarity. In this rebellion lies their empowerment. What once felt like curse reveals itself as calling. And through the fracture of falsehood, they step into strength untamed by the world. Chapter 7. How INFJs can break free. Empathy was never meant to be a burden. For the INFJ, it is a lantern, a way of seeing into the hidden currents of human souls. When reframed as vision, compassion is not exhaustion, it is prophecy. To carry such depth is not to drown, but to illuminate paths no one else dares to walk. The insights they hold cannot remain only in silence. Translated into small acts of service, they become bridges between what is felt and what is possible. In this translation, the unseen becomes seen and the intangible becomes anchor. I learned the loneliest truth in crowded rooms. A rare mind can be surrounded and still be unseen. Yet the danger is absorption-taking in the despair of the collective until it suffocates their own clarity. Boundaries must be forged, not as walls against love, but as vessels that protect it. The rare mind cannot afford to scatter itself into fragments. To guard their emotional labor is to honor its worth. Not every wound is theirs to carry, not every sorrow theirs to heal. Their energy is sacred currency, meant to be invested where it births transformation, not depletion. And in this guarding, they rediscover the ground beneath their own feet. Their worth cannot be borrowed from validation, nor weighed by the world's applause. It is anchored in their rare clarity, in the piercing sight that turns empathy into destiny. In that anchoring, the INFJ steps out of shadow into strength, not as a martyr of feeling, but as a visionary whose compassion builds LDS. Chapter 8. How INFJs can break free. What the world calls coldness is often nothing more than disciplined focus. For the INTJ, detachment is not absence but refinement, a deliberate guarding of energy, a refusal to scatter into noise. Their silence is strategy, their distance a form of precision. When understood rightly, it is strength, not flaw. This strategic detachment allows them to build structures others cannot imagine. It is the space in which vision sharpens, where patterns emerge untouched by distraction. I have carried visions no room could hold and paid the price of seeing too far. Yet that price became the blueprint for clarity, not its loss. Leadership for the INTJ is not about control, it is about direction. They see further ahead, and in leaning into that foresight, they guide without needing applause. What some dismiss as impractical is often the very foundation on which futures are quietly built. Tangible long-term wins silence the myths without the need for defense. Behind their rational frameworks lies a depth of care too rarely recognized. Every calculation holds the imprint of concern. Every plan is marked by the desire to prevent chaos from consuming what matters. Their heart beats inside their structure, steady, and unyielding. When they reclaim this truth, the accusation of coldness loses its teeth. They no longer waste energy proving warmth, they embody it in the endurance of their vision. What once was called distance is revealed as devotion, and what was mistaken for indifference becomes the architecture of lasting care. Chapter 9. Practical steps for both types. Freedom begins with awareness, but it takes form and practice. For the rare mind, the first act is to identify the lie that has settled deepest within and to challenge it each day, not with argument, but with embodiment. Each step taken against falsehood is a step into clarity. A journal of clarity becomes a sacred tool where insights are not left to vanish in thought, but are written into being. Here, intuition meets structure and vision finds form. I felt the fracture of being known in fragments. I would rather be whole and alone. In those pages, fragments reunite into a voice that cannot be silenced. Not every space is ready to receive depth. The INFJ and INTJ must choose their arenas wisely, sharing perspective only where resonance is possible. In these selective spaces, their truth is not drained, it is multiplied. To give it everywhere is to scatter pearls into shadows. Stereotypes lose power when reframed. What the world calls complication is clarity. What it calls detachment is focus. What it calls impracticality is foresight. Each false label becomes a mirror turned, revealing uniqueness as strength. Lies no longer shrink them, they are harvested for meaning. If you don't want to miss when we go further, especially when we bring in Nietzsche's perspective on rejecting false narratives, turn on the notifications. That way you'll get each piece of this journey as soon as it's out, ready to help you expand instead of shrink. And through this discipline, they return to the ancient call Nietzsche whispered, to create values rather than inherit them. In doing so, they shed the borrowed narratives of smallness and stand in the authority of their own design. Each act of clarity becomes rebellion, and each rebellion becomes liberation. Chapter 10. Integration from smallness to silent strength. Lies diminish, but clarity expands. The myths spoken over them were meant to reduce, to make the vastness of vision appear as fragility. Yet when truth rises, the false mirrors shatter, and what once felt like confinement reveals itself as initiation. The rare mind was never meant to shrink, it was meant to carry silence as a strength. Difference is not accident but destiny. What others misread as fracture is the hidden seat of power. In solitude, INFJs and INTJs discover the sharpening of vision, the kind that does not wither under misunderstanding but matures in its shadow. I have seen despair blink first when I refused to bow to it, and in that moment I learned that endurance is its own language. Their solitude does not hollow them, it hones them. In the stillness where others would collapse, they refine perception into blade, clarity into compass. They emerge not needing to prove myths wrong, but transcending them, for the truth does not argue, it simply stands. As we dive into the myth of being cold and uncaring, think of someone you know who's constantly misunderstood for their depth. Share this video with them. Sometimes all it takes is reframing one lie to remind someone of the power they actually hold, and so the path unfolds, from smallness to silent strength. Not the loud strength of dominance, but the quiet mastery of meaning, the kind that does not fade with applause or crumble under rejection. Their destiny is not in defending against lies, but in embodying the rare clarity that renders those lies irrelevant. What the world once called weakness becomes the very mark of their calling, and through it they walk not diminished, but crowned in the gravity of their difference.